Hello, everyone. Welcome to, I forget what week it is, but we're talking about organizational deviance this week. It's week 5. Anyway, organizational deviance. Um, it's not hard in today's day and age to find examples of organizational deviance. If you do a quick Google search of police misconduct, that would result in a large number of news sources detailing some form of police misconduct or police deviance. You find results of stories of excessive force, deadly force used in the wrong situations, or some other form of corruption. And no doubt, those are forms of organizational deviance. But deviance is much more encompassing than just these types of extreme events. If you get into the academic literature of organizational deviance, you'll find a multitude of articles addressing a wide variety of deviance issues. And then if you look at the examples in the beginning of the book here, the beginning of the chapter, you'll see a variety of different events, some of which would certainly be what anyone I think would consider to be an organizational failure at some level, while others, such as the van accidentally hitting some people, may not immediately appear to be deviance, but rather just some form of terrible accident. So organizational deviance, by definition, is an event, activity, or circumstance that occurs in or because a formal organization deviates from their formal goals or normative standards or expectations, either simply because it occurs or because of the consequences that result in some kind of suboptimal performance or outcome that's not wanted. Now, this definition, may seem a little different than what you're used to, when you think about deviance, because this definition doesn't mean that someone actually acted inappropriately or violated any laws or regulations, but rather deviance means that something happened that doesn't fit with the goals or expectations of performance for that particular organization. So we're going to talk about a couple of theories or explanations for why this happens. So the first one we're going to talk about is administrative breakdown. If you remember from previous sections, we covered some principles of administrative management. So then, if those principles are not adhered to, that would probably result in some sort of administrative breakdown. And since most criminal justice organizations are bureaucratic organizations, breakdown results when managers fail to adequately implement or enforce administrative principles, which then result in some type of deviance or other adverse outcome. So if you look at the examples provided in the book, it's clear that there was administrative breakdown in those events. The second theory or explanation we're going to talk about is structural secrecy and knowledge conflict. Sometimes adverse events occur because decisions are made with incomplete information. Now, granted, any decision that you make, even not just criminal justice, just in life, right? And just any decision that you make, it's almost impossible to have all the relevant information all the time when you have to make those decisions. But sometimes, like in these situations we're talking about here, there's structural issues that exacerbate this problem. And what I mean is information sharing doesn't always occur as it should within an organization. Sometimes, it's intentional. Sometimes people don't want to share information for fear someone else may get credit for an arrest or just whatever. They just don't want to share it. But other times, it's more of a function of how the organizations are organized and how they're supposed to function. And we talked about complexity and how organizations are structured. So as they get bigger, especially bureaucratic organizations, as they get bigger, you end up with a lot more divisions. If you think about an organizational chart, you got all these different boxes, right? Those are all different divisions within that organization. Well, as it gets bigger, those divisions get more isolated from other divisions where people in other divisions have no idea what's going on anywhere else. And you can directly relate this to those 3 dimensions of complexity that we covered earlier in the semester. The more complex an organization, the greater chance that an information silo is created where information is not shared, where all the information is just kept right there and no one knows about it. And that's what's referred to as structural secrecy. When structural secrecy occurs, it can lead to knowledge conflict between administration and line level officers. If the understanding of the situation for administration or supervisors is different than that of line officers, that can lead to real problems if the decision makers don't fully understand what's occurring. So how do you fix it? Well, organizations have to work to have consistent information sharing. But oftentimes the problem is not that organizations, especially bureaucratic organizations, don't have some mechanism set up for information sharing. So the problem is oftentimes more underlying than it is, an outright information sharing issue. Now, intentionally not sharing information is one thing. But as those of you who work in criminal justice know, there's always paperwork involved with almost everything that's done. And that is an effort to increase information sharing. Problem is that sometimes so much information is shared that it becomes really cumbersome. And it's impossible to get through all that information. So they develop prioritization strategies, and so that some information is prioritized over others. And if the wrong information is prioritized, that can result in incomplete understanding of the situation and can lead to poor outcomes. The third perspective we're going to talk about is normal accidents. And Klinger talks about this in his article at the end of the chapter. This perspective looks at organizational deviance as that it's inevitable. Even under the best circumstances, things are going to happen that are unplanned. Excuse me. Now, by saying normal, it doesn't mean that it's something appropriate or acceptable. Okay? It just means that something is likely to occur. All right. So this theory focuses more on the system that is created by the organization. Okay. So if you think of an organization like a system, you think about the many different parts that are part of that organization, and these parts are coupled together, meaning that each part relies on another part of the system. Now, sometimes they're more tightly coupled, where they really rely on the other parts of the system, and other times it's more loosely coupled. But for it to be a system, all the parts rely on the other parts. So if you have a more tightly coupled system, it's more likely that a failure at any point in that system will result in a failure to other parts of the system, because each part relies highly on another part for proper functioning. When you have multiple parts fail, it can result in a system failure. Now, when we talk about these systems, systems can be linear or they can be complex. Linear means just straight line. Complex means you got a lot of different stuff going on. So the more linear the system, the more likely the parts work together in predictable ways, right? Because it's straight line. This. There's nothing unpredictable in there. It is what it is. But the more complex something gets, the more unpredictable the system becomes. The more moving parts you end up with within that system makes it more unpredictable, which makes it more susceptible to failure. The example they use in the book of a police pursuit is a great example of this. Talk about a police pursuit in a rural area, which is a much more linear type of event, versus a pursuit in an urban area, which is a much more complex system. So you have way more parts interacting within that system, which increases the chance of failure at any point in that system, which would then result in a less than favorable outcome. So these first three theories all dealt with preventing deviance, but it's also important to talk about what happens when something happens, okay? And that's more crisis management. Okay? Once something happens, how management handles that situation oftentimes has a direct impact on whether the situation is contained and damage minimized, or whether that situation is exacerbated. So an important part of crisis management is having a plan in place for when something occurs. And you can find examples just in the last few years of where something happened and the responding agencies had no idea what they should have been doing because they did not have any kind of crisis management plan in place. if you have to build something from scratch, you're wasting valuable time, right? So having a plan in place reduces uncertainty and it saves time. Now, that doesn't mean that crises are going to occur by the playbook, so to speak, where like, okay, now this happened, so we go to step 2 and then step 3, right? Things usually don't happen that way. But having a handbook or having some kind of policy in place gives a starting point for how things should be handled. Problems can also occur during the actual response to the crisis. You know, if you have situations with a lack of coordination among units or agencies, you know, that can lead to problems, as can crisis paralysis, which results when agencies are unable to implement an effective response. So finally, the third part of crisis management is that crises aren't over simply when the crisis is over. Okay, what happens afterwards is also very, very important. How management brings everybody back together, how management tries to return the organization to some state of normalcy, what happens after that is very important. If it's not done correctly, other crises can spawn out of the inconsistency that's happening or the turmoil that is still occurring within that organization. So while normal accident theory says that things are inevitable, there's some types of organizations that have been able to avoid deviance, even though they have all the risk factors. You know, all these factors we've been talking about, tightly coupled systems, all that type of thing. So even though some organizations have the risk factors, they don't always end up having some form of deviance or accident. And these are called high reliability organizations, or HROs. So there's basically five characteristics that separate them from other organizations. First, I'm gonna call them HROs. First, HROs are actually worried about failure, and they impose systems to that end. They impose systems on themselves that are designed to detect, report, record instances of failure in order so they can learn from them. So when things go wrong within the organization, they have systems in place to address that. So it's kind of like an early warning type of system. And some police departments do have these type of systems built into their structures. They call them a variety of things like early intervention protocols or something similar to that, where they're able to detect problems early and get them addressed before they turn into real problems or some form of deviance. Another thing these organizations do is they're reluctant to reduce situations to simple explanations. You know, sometimes the simplest explanation is the best, but oftentimes problems are more complex and there's multiple causes, especially if you're in a tightly coupled system. Okay, there may be one thing that it seems obvious is the problem, but more than likely there's multiple things that are interacting that are causing the problem. The third thing they do is they pay close attention to the inner workings of their organization, right? Because that's where a lot of these problems are going to come from. So they pay particular attention to how things are functioning within their organization. They're also designed to contain problems and limit their damage. Okay, they also have protocols in place where if something does happen, it's kind of like a shutoff valve, right? They have shutoff valves in place where if something happens, they can turn it off before it gets out of hand and limit whatever damage may occur. It's kind of like turning the water off in your house if you have a leak in your pipe, right? You find the leak, you shut the water off to your house, you stop any further damage. Finally, HROs defer to expertise within their organizations. Bureaucratic organizations, especially criminal justice organizations, oftentimes have very rigid guidelines and very rigid protocols about who is supposed to do what. Well, that isn't always the best way to address something. Sometimes who is designated to address it doesn't know what's going on, doesn't know how to address it, doesn't understand the situation, but there may be someone else in the organization that does. HROs defer to expertise. Okay, just because someone is supposed to do it doesn't mean they're the ones that actually do it. They rely on experts who can guide the organization through whatever through whatever is happening. All right, so what then happens if you have an event that an organization cannot recover from? Most organizations do recover. They may look different when they come out on the other side, but most organizations, especially public organizations, do recover from deviance type events. Now, if you go through the book, there's all kinds of definitions about what constitutes organizational termination, and academics argue about terminology. But what generally happens is that organizations are restructured, they're rebranded, they're somehow changed. Organizational termination really only occurs when an organization completely ceases to exist. And if we're talking about public agencies, that's when municipalities or whoever decides to not fund them anymore and no longer sanctions them. Like at that point, that organization is done. That organization is terminated. Okay, that doesn't happen that often. It does happen, of course, but oftentimes they just restructure and come out on the other side somehow changed. Because public organizations are more resilient than private organizations, right? Public organizations have the backing of the government, so that makes them more resilient than a private organization that makes a poor decision and suffers the consequences for that. But like I said, that doesn't mean they don't ever disappear or terminated. So what happens when they do? One of the main ones that you talk about a lot in this kind of literature or whatever is, police departments. What happens when a police department disappears or is terminated? And there's been a lot of debate the last, 15 years or so about merging of police departments. Is it better for municipalities to all have their own police department, or is it better to contract services? Is it better for two small municipalities to merge together to have kind of a bigger police department that handles both places, or is it better for them to have separate police departments? And there's really no correct answer to that. Every situation is different. Some people say, well, if a municipality loses their police department, that they have a reduction in services. Like, for example, it's harder to do community policing, in a small municipality when you say they've contracted policing for the sheriff's department, right? As opposed to their own municipal police officers who live there and may be more prone to community policing. Some argue that you don't get a personal touch, from some organization that you've contracted services for, and there's some validity to those arguments. But the other side of the coin is a lot of times these municipalities really couldn't afford to have police departments in the first place. So when they contract or merge with other organizations, that actually increase the amount of services that are available. Because a lot of these bigger departments do have more services that are available to people and can help them in a variety of situations. So the debate continues, and I'm going to stop here for this chapter. I've talked for quite a while here. There's an interesting article on Blackboard about deviance that talks about whether people are more prone for deviance if they're a night person versus a morning person. And it's really interesting. As you read that, think about what that might mean for police officers. Okay, because police officers work a variety of shifts and the shifts rotate, right? So sometimes you're on days, sometimes you're on nights. Is that really the best way to go about it, right? Should you put night people only on at night, day people only on a day? Is that fair? Would it reduce organizational deviance? I don't know. So as you read that article, think about those kinds of issues. There's also 2 articles at the end of the book or end of the chapter. Make sure you read those. Be sure to complete the assignments for this week. They're all located in the folder on Blackboard. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll see you next week.